Hi, for this video what I want to do is show you how to derive the quadratic formula. And basically where this was derived from was we take the standard form of any quadratic equation, the literal formula, and what we are going to do is we are going to complete the square, because the quadratic formula and completing the square are the two methods that will always work no matter what type of quadratic equation you have. Factoring does not always work. Factoring only works if you have a factorable trinomial. So the quadratic formula and completing the square are the two methods that will always work. Basically what happened is over time, mathematicians were tired of completing the square over and over again, so they just came up with the quadratic formula. So basically what we're going to do here is we're going to go through this like we would any other completing the square formula. And so the first thing that we want to do is, remember, to complete the square we want the leading term to be 1. So I'm going to divide all of my terms by a. So I want to get the leading coefficient or the leading term to be 1. So now I would have x squared plus b divided by a times x plus c divided by a equals 0. Okay, and I know with variables that this looks very, very complicated. It is harder to comprehend than dealing with numbers. But what we want to do is we're going to treat this is our constant term. It does not have an x in it. So we want all of our x terms on one side and our non-x term, our constant term, on the other. So I'm going to move this c over a to the opposite side. And so I'm left with x squared plus b divided by a times x is equal to negative c over a. And now, just like any other completing the square problem, I'm going to add a blank to both sides. I have to figure out what would I add to both sides to make this a perfect square trinomial. So what we're going to do is we're going to take half of our middle term. So I'm going to do half of b over a. And I'm going to square this whole thing. So basically what happens here, if I take half of b over a, this is really b over 2a. And then when I square it and put it into here, I'm left with b squared over 4a squared. So I would plug in over here the same thing, b squared over 4a squared. Okay, and really with this, once you have the quadratic formula, once you see that it works, it's easier just to use the quadratic formula. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to simplify both sides. So on this side here, what I'm going to do is we have made this now where it's a perfect square trinomial, so I'm going to factor it down into the values that I squared. So remember, the first term was x. Okay, the square root of the second term is just half of the middle term, so I would do b over 2a equals, and over here, in order to add these together, I must have a common denominator. So my denominator is 4a squared. So what I have to do with the first part right here is I have to get this a to be 4a squared. So to be able to add these together, I have to multiply this by 4a. And I also have to multiply the a on the bottom by 4a. Okay, and then just so that it looks like the quadratic formula, I'm going to write it in the format that they normally do. So they always start with the b squared part here. So I have b squared minus, and then this is really 4ac, so I'm just kind of writing it in the format that we would see it in the quadratic formula. And this is all going to be over 4a squared. Okay, so now what we want to do is, because remember, to undo a square, we want to take the square root of both sides. And when I take the square root of both sides, I'm left with x plus b over 2a equals, the top part I cannot simplify. So I'm going to have the plus or minus, because remember, with quadratics, we're always looking for the positive and the negative. And so then I would have the b squared minus 4ac. The bottom I can take the square root of. So remember that this is really, another way of writing this is the square root of b squared minus 4ac over the square root of 4a squared. So instead of writing it as one big fraction, I can write it individually. And then if I take the square root of 4a squared, I'm left with 2a. And now my last step is going to be to get x by itself. So I'm going to move the b over 2a to the opposite side. Since it's positive, when I move it to the opposite side, it becomes a negative b over 2a. Plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all over 2a. And traditionally we don't see it like this. We do go ahead and simplify it into one fraction. And so now we're just going to write it as the quadratic formula as we know it. The negative b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac, all over 2a. So this is what's going to happen every single time that you are solving a quadratic equation by completing the square. This is what's going to end up as your final result. So instead of having to go through the process of completing the square for all of your values, it has already been done for you, and that is where the quadratic formula came from. As always, thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know. If there are additional topics you need me to cover, please let me know that as well.